In the brutal winter of 1857, a mystery unfolded in the remote Utah territory that would haunt the Mormon community for generations. 4 women, Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Witmore, vanished from their isolated homestead without leaving a single footprint in the deep snow. Their husband, Ezekiel Witmore, offered a baffling explanation: they had departed to visit family back east. This was an impossible journey given the season's ferocious conditions, the worst on record. For over 6 decades, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints classified the incident, sealing it within their private archives. The truth remained buried until 1920, when construction workers breaking ground for a new meeting house in Mill Creek unearthed a discovery that would force the church to confront this dark chapter from its pioneer past. What they found challenged the very foundations of faith, family, and the immense price paid to build a Zion in the wilderness. The Utah Territory of 1847 was a land of stark contrasts, a place of profound faith and brutal hardship. When Brigham Young declared, "This is the place," upon seeing the Salt Lake Valley, he was viewing a vast alkaline desert surrounded by imposing mountains that would isolate his followers for months each year. For the Mormon pioneers, this isolation was divine providence, a sanctuary where they could practice their faith free from the persecution that had driven them from Missouri and Illinois. Ezekiel Witmore arrived with the second wave of migrants in late September 1847. A skilled 34-year-old carpenter from Vermont, he had converted after hearing Joseph Smith speak in Nauvoo. He was accompanied by his 4 wives, all married to him under the church's principle of plural marriage. Sarah, his first wife, was 31, a steady and capable woman who had been with him for 8 years. Her inability to bear children, within Mormon theology of the time, made plural marriage not just acceptable, but a celestial necessity. She had personally selected Rebecca Thornton, 27, as Ezekiel's second wife in 1845. Rebecca was unusually educated for a woman of her era, fluent in both English and German, and known to question church doctrine with an intellectual curiosity that made some uncomfortable, though Ezekiel seemed to value her insights. The third wife, Mary Kellerman, was 24 and pregnant with her first child. Orphaned during the Nauvoo period, she had no family beyond the Witmore household. The fourth, Ruth Caldwell, was just 19. Her marriage to Ezekiel had been arranged by church elders for her protection after her own family was killed in the Missouri conflicts. Ezekiel chose to settle in Mill Creek, southeast of the main Salt Lake settlement, drawn by a year-round creek and promising farmland. More importantly, the isolation suited his private, introverted nature. That first autumn, he worked with frantic intensity to build a large, solid cabin with separate rooms for each wife, preparing for the harsh winter he knew was coming. Their nearest neighbors were a Danish family 3 miles away, but once the snows began, they would be completely cut off from the world. The Witmore household was a model of efficiency and harmony, at least on the surface. Sarah managed domestic affairs with quiet skill, organizing their precious food stores. Rebecca kept meticulous records and taught herself basic medicine. Mary, despite her pregnancy, excelled at preserving food, and Ruth brought youthful energy to the hardest physical labor. A visit from Bishop William Curtis in early December confirmed this impression. He noted in his journal their apparent unity and prosperity. Yet in his private diary, he confessed to unease. The women moved with an eerie synchronization, finishing each other's sentences. He also noticed small identical cuts on each of their wrists, which they dismissively attributed to kitchen accidents. The winter of 1847 to 1848 was exceptionally severe. Snow began in mid-November, and temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero. The last confirmed sighting of all 4 women was on December 19th, when hunters passed the cabin and briefly spoke with Sarah and Rebecca, who declined an invitation to Christmas services, stating they would hold their own family worship. The first sign of trouble came on January 8, 1848, when Ezekiel arrived at the main settlement, a gaunt and disheveled figure who seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. He requested a private meeting with Bishop Curtis and explained that Sarah had received a revelation directing her to travel east to care for a sick sister in Missouri. He claimed she had felt the calling so urgently that she left immediately with a group of passing travelers. The bishop was instantly suspicious. No sensible travelers would attempt an eastward journey in the dead of winter, and Sarah had never mentioned a sister in Missouri. As Bishop Curtis pressed him, Ezekiel's story began to unravel. He changed details, first saying the travelers were missionaries, then mountain men who knew secret routes. His hands trembled, and he grew agitated at the suggestion that the bishop should check on the remaining wives, claiming they were observing a period of spiritual purification that required absolute isolation. Bishop Curtis wrote in his private diary of his growing fear that Ezekiel was concealing something far more earthly and terrible. 3 weeks later, Ezekiel returned with another disturbing tale. Rebecca, too, had received a calling to teach at a mission school back east and had departed with another group. This time, Bishop Curtis insisted on visiting the cabin. Ezekiel became defensive, claiming Mary and Ruth were now ill with a contagious fever, but promising to bring them to town when they recovered. His suspicions now fully aroused, Bishop Curtis organized a party of 5 men and made the treacherous journey through the deep snow to the Witmore homestead on February 3rd. They found Ezekiel alone by a meager fire. His story shifted again. Mary and Ruth had recovered and decided to join the others in the east, departing just 2 days prior with trappers. The bishop asked to see the women's belongings. The rooms appeared hastily cleared of personal items, but heavy furniture and cooking implements remained, unlikely choices for a permanent relocation. Most troubling was the evidence of extensive digging in the frozen ground behind the cabin, which Ezekiel claimed was for expanding the root cellar. The amount of disturbed earth seemed excessive for that purpose. The men stayed the night, and the atmosphere was deeply unsettling. The cabin was silent, devoid of the subtle sounds of women's presence. Ezekiel served only preserved foods, though the household should have had fresh bread and dairy. Most chillingly, one of the men, Thomas Garrett, was awakened by the faint but distinct sound of weeping, seemingly emanating from beneath the cabin floor. The others dismissed it as the wind, but Garrett remained certain he had heard human distress. Bishop Curtis left the next morning, his fears confirmed. In his diary, he wrote that the isolation of winter and the pressures of plural marriage may have driven Ezekiel to commit acts that would bring shame upon our people and our faith. However, with the Mormon community already under intense scrutiny from the federal government over the practice of polygamy, the bishop faced an impossible dilemma. A public scandal could justify government intervention and threaten the entire settlement. He decided to monitor the situation quietly and await the spring thaw for answers. Throughout the rest of the winter, Ezekiel made sporadic appearances in town, growing increasingly haggard. He spoke of receiving letters from his wives confirming their safe arrival and happiness, but could never produce them, claiming they were too personal or had been accidentally burned. The community began to whisper. Some believed he had sent his wives away out of poverty or domestic strife. Others feared something much darker. When the snow finally melted in April, Bishop Curtis returned to the Witmore property to conduct a proper investigation. The cabin was dusty and abandoned. In Rebecca's old room, beneath a loose floorboard, he found her treasured leather-bound journal. Its final entry, dated December 20th, 1847, was written in a shaking hand. "E says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family, but I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." Behind the cabin, the thawing earth revealed the truth. The digging site was far larger than any root cellar. Partially buried in the soil were fragments of fabric matching the women's dresses and personal items, including Sarah's wedding ring. Nearby were the remains of several fires arranged in a deliberate pattern, their ashes containing burned fragments of religious texts with extreme interpretations of concepts like blood atonement and eternal sealing through sacrifice. Inside the cabin, in a hidden compartment, the bishop found Ezekiel's notebooks. They documented a descent into religious obsession with what he called the principle of ultimate consecration, a belief that God demanded the surrender of everything, including life itself, to achieve the highest celestial glory. The writings revealed he believed his family had been chosen for a special divine mission requiring extraordinary sacrifice. The later entries became increasingly erratic, filled with visions of eternal glory and disturbing references to the willing offering of innocence and the sealing power of shed blood. Ezekiel himself had vanished into the western wilderness, untraceable. Faced with evidence suggesting he had murdered his 4 wives as part of a twisted religious ritual, the church leadership made a difficult decision. Fearful that public knowledge would fuel anti-Mormon persecution and threaten their fragile community, they classified the entire incident. The official records were sealed. The Witmore cabin was dismantled, the disturbed earth restored, and the property purchased by the church and deemed unsuitable for future settlement. The 4 women were officially recorded as having relocated east, their disappearance explained as a private family matter. But secrets rarely stay completely buried. Whispers and legends persisted in the community for decades. Some spoke of Ezekiel's madness, others of a dark bargain made for survival. The most disturbing rumors suggested the women had been willing participants, convinced by their husbands' revelations that their sacrifice was necessary for eternal salvation. The area gained a reputation for being haunted, with travelers reporting eerie feelings and the sound of women's voices on the winter wind. For over 70 years the truth remained hidden until 1920, when construction began on a new meeting house in the growing Mill Creek area. On October 17th, steam shovels excavating the foundation struck stone 4 feet down. Workers uncovered a meticulously constructed stone chamber, 8 feet square. Inside they found 4 neat piles of women's clothing, dresses, shoes, undergarments, along with personal effects like combs and jewelry. Most significantly, each pile contained a small leather purse holding identification papers belonging to Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Witmore. The items were perfectly preserved. The local bishop, unaware of the history, contacted church headquarters in Salt Lake City. Elder James Tanner, a member of the Quorum of the 12 with access to confidential archives, rushed to the site. The discovery of the chamber confirmed the church's worst fears. Among the papers were final letters from each wife, written shortly before their deaths. They were haunting testaments to their twisted faith. Sarah's letter expressed gratitude for her selection by divine providence to participate in a sealing ordinance for eternal family unity. Rebecca's was more theological, referencing obscure doctrines and the belief that shedding innocent blood in righteousness opened the doors to celestial glory. Mary's was heart-rending, speaking of her unborn child and her faith that their double sacrifice would be a greater offering to the Lord. Ruth's was brief, expressing love and excitement about joining the eternal family in the most sacred way. The letters made it terrifyingly clear. The women had not been murdered against their will but had been willing participants in a ritual they believed would grant them salvation. Elder Tanner immediately suspended construction and ordered a full review of the sealed Witmore files. What those files revealed was even more alarming. Bishop Curtis's original investigation notes contained references to correspondence between Ezekiel and other men who had received similar revelations, an intercepted letter from 1849 signed only J.M. spoke cryptically of the completion of the work and mentioned others who received the same calling. This suggested Ezekiel was not a lone madman but part of a secret group within the early church, an extremist cell that had twisted Mormon doctrine to justify ritual murder as the ultimate act of faith. Elder Tanner's team began a secret review of early church records and uncovered a pattern. Between 1847 and 1855, at least 12 other families had reported members disappearing under similar circumstances, always explained as departing for missions or family visits back east. The victims were predominantly women and children from polygamous families, whose complex structures made absences less noticeable. The perpetrators were often men noted for their extreme devotion and local leadership roles. This secret group, it appeared, had developed a full theological framework for their actions, seeing themselves as pioneers of a higher law beyond plural marriage that required ultimate consecration through sacrifice. The church's excavation of the site expanded, revealing the stone chamber was just the beginning. Beneath it lay a larger, more sinister underground space carved into bedrock, a ritual chamber 12 feet square. Its walls were covered in carved symbols mixing Mormon, Egyptian and Masonic imagery. In the center stood a stone altar, stained with blood later confirmed to be human. It was surrounded by 4 smaller stone platforms, each inscribed with one of the wives' names and dates from that winter. The inscriptions included distorted scripture passages justifying the taking of life. Beneath these platforms, the team made the grisliest discovery of all: the meticulously preserved remains of the 4 women. Each had died from an identical, precise wound to the heart, likely from a ceremonial blade. They had been dressed in elaborate white ceremonial robes before their deaths. The chamber's design, with drainage channels and storage spaces, showed it was built for repeated use. Stone tablets in wall niches provided a horrifying minute-by-minute account of the rituals, describing the women's final words of faith and gratitude. Records indicated at least 8 other individuals from 3 different families had been killed there between 1848 and 1855. The investigation revealed the group was led by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who claimed to have received direct revelations from Joseph Smith in Nauvoo to establish the Order of Eternal Sacrifice. Blackwood had identified and recruited Ezekiel Witmore, targeting his religious fervor, isolation and family structure. The order had cells across multiple settlements, communicating through coded letters and secret meetings. The Mill Creek Chamber was one of several permanent ritual sites. The church had apparently discovered the order in the mid-1850s. Under Brigham Young's direction, a secret purge had occurred. Members were excommunicated, forced to flee or reassigned, ritual sites were destroyed, and all records sealed to prevent a devastating scandal. The discovery in 1920 proved the order's activities had been more extensive and organized than previously feared. Elder Tanner presented his full findings to the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 in November 1920. The evidence was undeniable and catastrophic: a systematic conspiracy of ritual murder within the early church, possibly involving dozens of victims. Faced with this truth, President Heber J. Grant made a momentous decision. To protect the church from scandal and the faith of millions of members, the truth would be buried again deeper than before. The evidence was placed in the church's most secure archives. The victims were memorialized in private ceremonies. The construction site was filled with concrete, and the meeting house was built elsewhere. All involved were sworn to secrecy. A quiet follow-up investigation revealed the order had not been fully eradicated. Cells had persisted in remote mining camps in Nevada and Colorado into the 1870s. Jeremiah Blackwood himself, now an old man, was found living under an alias in Colorado in 1895, still practicing his beliefs with a new group of followers. Church agents quietly located and eliminated these remaining cells without involving public authorities. The full scope was horrifying: over 200 victims across the West between 1847 and 1875. The stone chambers under Mill Creek remain sealed today. The truth about the Witmore family and the Order of Eternal Sacrifice rests in the church's most vaults, a burden known only to a select few leaders in each generation. The modern community of Mill Creek thrives, its residents largely unaware of the terrible history beneath their peaceful town. The church continues to debate whether this dark chapter should ever be revealed, each generation concluding that the potential harm outweighs the historical need for truth. The story of the 4 women who vanished without a footprint in the snow endures as a haunting reminder of how faith can be twisted into fanaticism and how the pursuit of heaven can lead to the destruction of earth.